Hello everyone, my name is Michael Rusin. I am a developer. I've been developing for a number of years and etc. You should know who I am by now if you watch this channel. So today I'd like to take a very specific subject, not one that is general, not one that is adhering to any abstract principles or whatnot, not in the general term, but this time in the very specific term. And the subject I'd like to talk about in question is middleware a necessary evil? Those of you not in the know, middleware is something that is the reference of things that are acting as a middle actor for things, such as third-party APIs, server handling, state handlers of servers, reducers, and things akin to that. I would also, to some degree, say that dependencies of servers and whatnot, such as caching, pre-caching, and all those kinds of things, I would kind of say that they're middleware, sort of. They third-party APIs and dependencies and things that you put in the middle. Are they a necessary evil? So this really comes down to environment. What do you work with? What is your stature of doing? What is it that you're doing? But as a programmer, I feel that middleware is actually a really bad thing, in my opinion. In my opinion, it is. Because we live under this pretense of that we have to externalize to our customer, we have to put everything, integrate everything into a cloud, put it in a cloud hosting, put it on GitHub, somewhere else remote hosting, and whatnot. And it causes problems in the long run because the more you create middlemen, basically, the more hands you have to go through in terms of processing things, especially when it comes to servers, server handlings like mail servers, configurations of mail servers and DNSs and like domain name services and server handling like external services. Do you have databases on external servers? Do you have reducers on external servers? And do you have server hosting at all overall somewhere else and whatnot? And what happens is that you have a problem that you could theoretically, technically solve it very quickly if you had the concrete matter of having everything at hand, right? If you had everything localized, you could, with the right expertise, solve that very quickly. But here's the problem. A lot of people, they go with middleware because they think that it'll help them. It'll solve their problems, And that's not true. It doesn't. Excuse me, having problems with the camera a bit. So a lot of people, they think that it will help them, but a lot of times it doesn't. Let me take a couple of examples of personal experience. We were supposed to do some RESTful integration in terms of a Glassfish server. Now, if you don't know, Glassfish is a pre-built server construction, basically. A pre-deployable server construction. And you can just feed in dependencies and external APIs and whatnot best to your heart's content, right? Here's the problem. One of the internal dependencies of Glassfish to run was bugged. And no one knew this. There was no clear documentation of this. It was a very subtle error. It was a nested error, basically. It would tell you error status 500, internal server error. And since it didn't have explicit error reporting, it would just say that. It would not tell you what dependency was failing and what row and whatnot. So this took hours to fix. This was something that, was basically just one jar needing the correct version. It takes about, a minute or two to download, and then you replace that in the library dependency in the project. That's about 5 minutes of work. Effectively, if everything was working, ideally, that would be 5 minutes of work. But that took hours because no one fucking knew that this was a bug, that it was bugged. Everyone had forgotten, there was no documentation about it. And equally so, I've been in the state of where there was a bug in terms of when we were producing a website and we had a conflict of modules. We had a conflict of a DNS server, a mail server, basically, that we were supposed to send to, and a configuration in the .etc file. Basically, the IP configuration that was supposed to default to IPv4 did not. It did not have the preference in the etc configuration of the server set up correctly, right? But here's the problem. This was a third-party API. Ow! This was a third-party API. We didn't have the servers locally, so no one could really access the servers, and no one really knew what was fucking up except for the people working with it. And the people working with it had their stuff to do, you know. So that took like weeks to resolve, basically. That was a long process. You know, it was so many parts of integration, especially when it comes back to middleware, you know, that it's supposed to solve a problem that it doesn't. It's supposed to fix something, but it doesn't. You know, it's supposed to be ideally a working solution that you can just plug in and then have it work just like a product, but it doesn't because it's fucking programming, you know? Any coder knows this. Any decent coder knows this, that you never, ever, ever, ever have a that's like best case scenario. That's like fucking utopia, you know? Like running your code and everything's bug free. That's like, that never happens, basically. That it has to go through testing, has to go through iterations, it has to go through, you know, test suites or manual testing or automated testing or whatever, you know. It has to be fucking tested, it has to be integrated, it has to go through a lot of developers because it's complicated. But therein also lies the problem. That some brilliant person, and it's a smart idea really, but it's like the way to hell is paid with good intentions. That some smart developer came up with, oh yeah, third-party APIs, why not? Let's go, you know, let's put them, let's, you know, abstract this shit. Let's just put modules and plugins that are abstracted so that you can't see them. You don't have them localized, you know, you're not changing them. You're not building them from scratch. And ultimately, why I also think middleware is really bad is because ultimately it fosters a bad social stigma. It fosters a social thinking that our technological development should always occur through third parts. That our parts should never be localized, that it should be externalized, and we should work with it in a net of developers and whatnot. But this, according to science, with agile development amongst other things, it's, as the saying goes, that the more chefs you have, the worse the soup gets. Because the workflow, just because you add more people, does not mean it becomes better. It becomes more complicated, and it becomes more, the lowest common denominator that you follow becomes lower. You know, even if you have a really strict standard on your culture, there will always be a lowest common denominator. Well, Tom has 10 years of experience, but Jenny doesn't. This is not to do anything to do with genders, by the way. This only has to do with, like, fictive names. So, one developer A, has 10 years of experience, but developer B only has 2 years of experience. Then we can take the path, which is the developer who has 10 years of experience, because we have to integrate into a team, and the net result is worse. The net result is that we get a worse product. That we get a worse product in terms of time efficiency, customization, capability, integration, documentation. All of it is generally just adhering to a lower standard of denominator. You know? And to me, that's why I really, really dislike middleware. Because middleware sounds good on paper to someone who doesn't really listen. You know, it sounds great, doesn't it? Oh, we'll fix the reducers and the thread management of your servers. It's like Java, you know. It's like the We're not a virtual machine. You don't have to care about garbage collection. And then there's no one that really, like, when they stop thinking about the implication of this, that this has actual technical implications, such as in the case of Java, where lack of garbage collection means that memory management becomes a nightmare, becomes really unoptimized. And equally so, thread management is like when people don't have thread management, it's like when we were working on a server and the main working thread that was processing the post request bugged. It had an erroneous rest path, basically, so it didn't know the target path. Basically, it was 404. And this doesn't prevent working thread execution. It doesn't crash execution. It reports an error, but it's not a fatal exception, basically. And what occurred was that people were under the social stigma, this belief. The teacher tells me, like, oh no, the program crashed. It's like, no, it didn't. No. Just because the graphical working thread bugged does not mean the entire thing fucking crashed and burned. It doesn't work like that. And that's why I really think that, in my opinion, middleware is the worst. And I keep iterating this because it's supposed to do something. It's supposed to live up to an expectancy, but in reality, it can never ever do that. There is a realistic gradient of, what was promised, what is the reality. You have to understand that there can often be a layer of disparity, of differential between what is promised and what is reality. Right? And that's absolutely the case with middleware. People think that, all right, well, we got a Glassfish server and it's going to fix our problems, or a Tomcat server and it's going to fix our server integration and whatnot. And then when, you're vulnerable to attacks, so you can't integrate SSL into that because you don't have, you bought a certificate and you initialize with a certain encryption, and then that encryption doesn't work and whatnot. It's always this. It builds this Kevlar tower. If you ever had Kevlar, like wood sticks, basically, and it builds this Kevlar tower of assumptions. Well, assuming that the database structure that is prefabricated works, assuming that the middleware works, assuming that the server structure works, assuming that the third-party API works, assuming that the person sitting in the next fucking door next to you does his job. That's a lot of assumptions. And by probability of statistics, and I'm not going to go too deep into that because that could, become a whole vector of ranges of different things. By statistical probability, you are more and more likely, the more, stages of potential failure you are introducing, the more and more likely you are to occur to failure. The more and more likely you are to run into the state of failure. Right? The more steps that can fail, the more likely you are to run into failure by virtue of there being more of them. Pretty basic math, basically. Like pretty basic statistics, And some people will maybe try to argue the fact of, but that's not how statistics work. But whatever. I know I'm right on that subject, and I'm not really going to go into a discussion on that. It's just experience, basically. So that was like my vlog for the day, I guess, or like my discussion, my rant, I guess. My video about this. And I will continue to do these, I think, on different subjects, on different languages and whatnot, because I think it's interesting, because that's what I feel is giving me fulfillment intellectually, basically. Anyway, guys, my name is Michael Roos, and I thank you very much for listening. I will talk to you next time. Bye!